The US president has set his sights on the world's largest island, Greenland. The island governs itself, but it's part of the Kingdom of Denmark, a member of both NATO and the European Union. And that's why tensions around this icy territory are suddenly running high. Greenland is rich in natural resources and strategically vital, often called the gateway to the Arctic. The president says the United States should buy the island or, if necessary, take it. He argues it's essential for America's national security and even for the strength of NATO. Europe, meanwhile, is alarmed. We've seen frantic shuttle diplomacy to Washington. So what happens next, and how does this end? And while all this unfolds, are Russia and China preparing for their own fight over Arctic dominance? And to the point, we ask, Trump eyes the Arctic. Will Europe defend Greenland? Welcome to this week's To The Point. I'm Javier Arguedas. It's good to have you with us. Let's meet today's guests. Michael Paul is a security expert and Arctic specialist. He is a senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Anja Wehler-Schöck is the international editor of Berlin's daily Tagesspiegel and member of its editorial board. During the first Trump administration, she worked for the German government in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, she worked in the Middle East for several years. And Rasmus Sinding Søndergaard is a historian and senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, specializing in U.S. foreign policy and transatlantic relations. He joins us from Copenhagen. To all of you, welcome and thank you for being with us. Well, here we are, not even a year into Donald Trump's second term, and we're already talking about a possible invasion of Greenland. Anja, how did we get here?
Well, during the past year of the second Trump administration, we've really seen a lot of developments that are without precedents. And he has marked this presidency with his unpredictability, and this we see play out right now with regard to Greenland. And when we look what's happening around Greenland, there is precedents in the U.S. breaking international law. There is precedents in the U.S. intervening in Latin America. But what is new now in its quality is that the U.S. is turning on NATO allies and is threatening the transatlantic alliance, threatening to invade a NATO ally. And this is shaking Europe to the core right now and would, of course, mean immense insecurity, not only in the Atlantic, but also in Europe.
And we're seeing European leaders, of course, trying to avoid that at all costs. Michael, we saw Denmark's and Greenland's foreign ministers in the White House meeting U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance. What do you make of that meeting and what resulted from it?
I think it was very important to start a dialogue with Americans about Greenland and to buy some time because, we need some more time to think it over, and that makes also perfect sense to send some military people to Greenland to find out where we could help and strengthen the defense and security of Greenland.
We're seeing exactly that. Military efforts, Rasmus, Denmark, Sweden, France and Germany are now deploying troops into Greenland. Do you agree? Is that the right move? And what's the point of it?
Well, officially, the point, of course, is to have a NATO exercise in Greenland that should address some of the security concerns expressed by President Trump and others with regards to increased sort of Russian and Chinese presence in the Arctic in general. Of course, we all know that the timing and the reason for this sudden European interest in defending Greenland has much more to do with President Trump's demands of control over Greenland. So in reality, this is, of course, to send a signal to the Americans that Europe, along with Denmark and Greenland, is not willing to go along with his plans to expand U.S. territory.
And one of the big questions, of course, is why and why now? Let's have a look at what's at stake. Suddenly, the world is focused on a frozen island in the far north. Why now? Greenland may look remote, but its resources, location, and military value make it a key player in the future of the Arctic and a hotspot of global interest.
Greenland is the largest island in the world, with almost 57,000 inhabitants. The island is autonomous, but is a part of Denmark. It is not in the EU, but is a NATO member. Donald Trump wants this island.
We're talking about acquiring, not leasing, not having it short term. We're talking about acquiring. If we don't do it, Russia or China will, and that's not going to happen when I'm president.
If necessary, Trump is prepared to take Greenland by force, where the US currently maintains a military base.
One way or the other, we're going to have Greenland.
His main argument is security interests, but the island is also a gateway to the Arctic. Its ice is melting due to climate change, and new shipping routes are opening up. Mineral resources also make Greenland highly attractive. Its rare earths could supply Europe for decades. In addition, the island holds gold, diamonds, uranium, oil, and natural gas. We're facing a geopolitical crisis. If we have to choose between the US and Denmark, we will choose Denmark.
Så vælger vi Danmark.
Who will decide Greenland's future?
Rasmus, this is not the first time the US says it wants to buy Greenland. Let's start with that possible scenario. How realistic is it?
Well, first of all, the US has historically expressed an interest in buying Greenland, the same way that the US, of course, has historically bought large pieces of territory in North America from various European powers. So that is, you could argue, and Trump argues, has historical precedent. However, of course, we thought that we abandoned that practice of buying other people and buying territory with the establishment of the rules-based order after 1945. So in recent time, it is, of course, unprecedented to suggest that you can buy the territory of another country. And then, very importantly, of course, Greenland has insisted that they are not for sale. And so then we're not really talking about buying a country. If the country is not for sale, then we're talking about pressure and coercion instead.
Michael, Trump says owning Greenland, as we saw, is necessary to safeguard the US. Is that true? Couldn't Trump, or the US for that matter, have access to the resources and to the military infrastructure with closer cooperation with Denmark, for example?
It would be very easy, and as a colleague from Copenhagen knows pretty well, various treaties make it possible, for example, to rebuild or reactivate the former US bases in Greenland. There was about 14 bases in 1945, and now there is only one, Pituffik Space Base, the former famous Thule air base. So it would be possible with just a minute to send more troops and in a longer way to reactivate the bases. So it's not necessary to annex Greenland. And for mining, I guess she's still the minister responsible for mining in Greenland. She wrote last year an op-ed in the Washington Post and backed for more U.S. investors for the mining industry, because there's only one American firm interested in holding a license for mining. So Greenland would, I guess, welcome more interest in Greenland, but not in occupying Greenland.
So if there is access to both the security and the resources in the current structure, if you will, Anja, many see imperialistic ambitions by the US under President Donald Trump. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you see that in these ambitions?
Yes, I absolutely agree with it. I think there are imperialistic and narcissistic ambitions to portray himself as a ruler of the world who can basically do whatever he wills. And I also want to build on what Michael just said with regard to the arguments that Trump presents. If his aim were to secure the Arctic, then NATO would be the first step. There is no state that is capable of unilaterally securing the Arctic. not the United States, not any other state. So if you aim at increasing security in the Arctic, you need cooperation, and NATO would be is built specifically for that. But instead of going the way to reinforce NATO's structure, he's threatening the alliance. So it's counterproductive. Also, as we saw in the video, the threats mentioned by Russia and China, many experts dispute that this threat is actually looming. And if you saw these threats, again, NATO would be your prime response. And Donald Trump specifically mentions Golden Dome. Under the existing agreements with Denmark, he would be able to increase the infrastructure, including a missile defense system like Golden Dome is. So there is no value to the arguments that Donald Trump presents. Instead, he's thinking of himself as a grand statesman trying to enlarge U.S. territory, but it does not have any substantial value, and of course completely goes against the right to self-determination and international law, and threatens the transatlantic alliance that the U.S. helped build after World War II.
Donald Trump clearly doesn't see, apparently, NATO as capable of defending the Arctic, if you will. Rasmus, this all inevitably leads to Europe. If Greenland is so important and is at risk by other international powers, why didn't Denmark or the European Union, for that matter, make those investments in security and, of course, also in resources?
First of all, I want to say that I agree with everything that's been said in the studio. It's good to hear the facts being laid out with regards to access to minerals, access to potential strengthening U.S. military presence in Greenland. Where Trump has a point is that Denmark and also NATO, because Denmark has not sufficiently invested in security in the Arctic in the several past decades. However, as our foreign minister pointed out in the US yesterday as well, the one country that has done the least to invest in security in the Arctic is the United States. As it was rightly said in the studio, the US used to have multiple military bases, thousands of troops in Greenland, and they decided unilaterally to pull those out. And it's totally within the framework of the existing defense agreement to re-establish a greater US military presence. So the US could address its self-identified problem. They do have a point that Denmark has also been neglecting security in the Arctic in recent decades, but it is a joint responsibility of the NATO alliance and of Denmark and the United States through the existing defense agreement to secure Greenland. So Denmark and the US together should have done more earlier. Now we're seeing Denmark and Europe stepping up, and hopefully the United States will come along and realize that NATO is the best framework for addressing security concerns, although I do have my doubts with regards to President Trump on that.
Mm-hmm. Michael, you seem to agree to what Rasmus was saying. The scenario we're confronted with now, however, is that all these arguments are not being seen in Washington. At least that's what we're hearing. Militarily speaking, how easy would it be for the U.S. to seize Greenland if there is no other option from the point of view of Donald Trump?
The invasion of Greenland is pretty easy. The more problematic point is that for a very long time, the Arctic states were not interested in having NATO or the European Union active in the Arctic. And Rasmus knows that pretty well, and I know it. Because it was, as sovereign states, they didn't want an involvement of NATO and European Union. Therefore, the investments didn't take place. And right now, since Pompeo in the first term of Trump declared the Arctic as an arena for power and power struggle, they woke up and now they got more active in arguing about security in the Arctic. But it's really a long-term game because, and the Golden Dome, I don't think that Trump will see it in the end of his term in 2029. But it needs a very long-term security build-up in the Arctic to be ready for Chinese armed forces in the Arctic in the 30s or 40s. That's a long way to go, but we have to be careful. We have to be aware of that, and we have to build up security and defense and deterrence in the Arctic too.
Against China and Russia, you say, not against the US?
On the long term, against in context of China. Yeah.
All right. Anja, we know that the US president needs congressional approval to perform military operations, like taking over Greenland. He didn't seem to take too much care about that in the case of the Venezuela military intervention. How much political and popular support does Donald Trump have to annex Greenland in one way or the other?
Well, the Democrats are profoundly against the moves he's making, of course, but we also see the MAGA camp and the Republicans split on the issue. And we just saw that the Senate failed to pass a bill limiting the powers of the president with regard to Venezuela. It was a bipartisan bill, but Trump largely influenced the Republican senators so that several senators decided not to vote for the bill. And there is a similar bill planned for Greenland, limiting the powers of the president with regard to Greenland. I'm not confident that it will pass because what we see in the second Trump administration is that he's massively pressuring any opposition against his legislation or the policies of his administration. So I'm not confident that the presidential powers will be limited specifically with regard to Greenland. When you look at the opinions within MAGA and the Republican camp, you see on the one hand within the MAGA camp and Republicans, people sympathizing with his big ego politics of enlarging U.S. territory, basically being the world ruler, doing whatever he pleases. On the other hand, within the MAGA camp, we have people who say, wait a moment, we campaigned with the promise to focus on the U.S. and not go and play in international theaters. And you have the transatlantic Republicans who are, of course, extremely worried about deepening the rift, breaking up the transatlantic alliance. So he has some opposition, but what we've seen is that he has a massive influence on limiting opposition to his policies.
A president that is often said to be unhinged, and of course we have to ask what that means for Europe. Across Denmark and much of Europe, alarm bells are ringing. For the first time, Denmark's military intelligence service has classified the United States under Donald Trump as a potential threat to European security and even to Denmark's own national safety.
I want to make clear that if the United States were to militarily attack another NATO country, it would mean the end of everything, both for NATO and for the security order that has been in place since the end of World War II. European leaders are now proposing to bolster NATO's presence in the Arctic to counter Trump's security claims. We are indeed discussing Greenland within NATO. We share the American concerns that this part of Denmark needs stronger protection. I hope we can reach a mutually acceptable solution within NATO. But Trump continues to issue threats, even hinting at violent annexation.
Maybe NATO would be upset if I did it. Maybe NATO would save a lot of money. I like NATO. I just wonder whether or not if we needed NATO, would they be there for us? I'm not sure they would.
Is Trump putting Greenland ahead of NATO?
It certainly seems so. Rasmus, there's now serious talk about the US invading NATO territory. What would that imply?
There is serious talk about it because the president is making the remarks that he's making. I do think we need to still be level-headed when it comes to this. I think that it's still a relatively unlikely scenario. Well, I have to admit that the likelihood is increasing over the past couple of weeks. It's also important to note that any sort of US military force in Greenland wouldn't be what we saw in Venezuela with bombing and stuff like that. The US has de facto military control over Greenland already, so it'd be a simple maneuver to just place a few more American special forces in Nuuk. But the consequences, of course, would be dramatic, as it would, as the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has said, essentially ruin NATO. Like the actual outcome, it would depend on the response from our European allies. But there is no doubt that a defensive alliance that's built on the concept of all for one for all, it's hard to see how that would operate in practice if one member state, the most dominant member state, actually violates the territorial integrity of another member state. So the consequences are profound. We will have to see how Europe would respond. I'm well aware that many European countries have other security interests that might be more pressing than what's going on in Greenland. You could argue that for the territorial safety of Denmark itself, Russia remains the bigger threat. And so there's a balance to be struck between pushing back against the US if they were to annex Greenland and violate international law, and then the realistic approach as well, which is we have the need for some form of US support with regards to the war in Ukraine and the Russian threat. It's a very delicate situation to be in for a small state like Denmark, who is still reliant on the US as our security guarantor, even at the same time as they are violating or threatening to violate our territorial integrity. It's a highly difficult situation to be in for a small state like Denmark.
It's also difficult for larger states like Germany, for sure. Michael, it's almost certain that NATO countries would not fire back. At least that's what I've read so far. What message would this send to China and Russia, the countries Donald Trump says it wants to deter?
I guess indeed Russia is a problem for Denmark in the context of the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, so less in the context of Greenland. But the message what Trump gives to other rulers in the world and autocrats is clearly that rules don't exist anymore, and the rules-based order is out of order, so to say. And that's a big problem for not the superpowers, but for smaller powers and small countries like Denmark, but even medium powers like Germany have a problem with that, because we have to deal with the whole world, and our trade bases on free and open markets, and that again rests on a rules-based order. So we need rules, but I think that even China is interested in having rules and a certain rules-based order. Also, it sees it from a Chinese point of view. But they are much more interested in rules than, for example, Russia. Yeah, Russia defines its own rules. Vladimir Putin, in that way, has more parallels to Trump as one can imagine, unfortunately.
Anja, what do you make of the reaction of European leaders so far in this situation? We haven't heard so much, despite these, shuttle diplomacy actions to Washington. Do you think Europe is reacting in the right way in this situation?
Yes, I think Europe needs to have a dual strategy to approach this problem. The first pillar is to de-escalate. So I think what European leaders have done so far goes in the right direction, because there is nothing that Europe can do militarily or economically should the US invade Greenland. So the aim has to be to dissuade the US with every possible means to go that far. And I think by de-escalating, as happened, for example, in the talks yesterday in DC between the leaders of Greenland and Denmark, that was great. It was great to see that there was no Zelensky moment when there was an escalation. So I think even though there was no agreement, which is obvious because there is profound dissent, it was a success in that it didn't lead to further escalation. The other pillar that I see for Europe is to really strengthen up. Europe needs to take the call for its sovereignty more seriously. It needs to create a strong security and defense system. It needs to work on its synergies, not having multiple defense systems, for example, really moving into that direction, because once more, Trump proves the U.S. is no longer a reliable ally when it comes to European security. And not only that, he might even pose a threat to Europe. So those are the two big to-dos, in my opinion, for Europe.
Mm-hmm. Michael, very briefly, do you think Europe has understood that the U.S. is now a threat?
Yeah, but we still need time to get ready with that message, because it's really a break of thinking which is unparalleled, and for my generation it's totally it's really a strange feeling.
We have time for one closing question. I'm going to ask the same question to all of you, but it is a yes/no question, so please be very, very brief. I know it's hard. Rasmus, my closing question: will Greenland mean the end of NATO?
If the US took control of Greenland through military force, then yes. I don't think that's going to happen, so no.
All right, Michael.
Same answer.
Yes. I agree. I think NATO has already been shaken without the US intervening as such, but with the threat of intervention, it's a profound disgruntlement to NATO. So I think the alliance isn't as strong as it used to be.
We'll see how that plays off. Thank you, all three of you, for today's discussion. Of course, we will keep you up to date on what goes on in Greenland here on DW. And remember, you can also watch every To The Point show on our YouTube channel. Just search for DW News. I'm Javier Arguedas. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Take care and goodbye.